Hello, I'm going to be reading the next chapter of The Little People. We're on chapter 4 now. Last time, in the last chapter, Pod the dad was seen by a boy. He was climbing down the curtain with a cup. So now they have to tell Arrietty. It's very serious when the little people get seen by the people upstairs. And they didn't know that there was a boy staying in the house. So it's come as a horrible surprise. Just before we get going, we had a little quiz last week. So the questions from last week were: number 1, who saw Pod? Number 2, what was Pod carrying? And number 3, what was Pod climbing down when he was seen? So the answer to question 1, Pod was seen by a boy. Question number 2, the answer is Pod was carrying a teacup. Okay, Homily asked him to go to the tea service in the doll's house and get her another teacup because of the one that Arrietty broke. And then the final question, what was Pod climbing down when he was seen by the boy? A curtain. It's very hard. Pod was very good at climbing. Okay. So let's get on with chapter 4. Arrietty's in bed, remember? Her mum sent her off to bed because they didn't want her to worry about what happened. Arrietty had not been asleep. She'd been lying under her knitted coverlet, staring up at the ceiling. It was an interesting ceiling. Pod had built Arrietty's bedroom out of 2 cigar boxes, and on the ceiling lovely painted ladies dressed in swirls of chiffon blew long trumpets against a background of blue sky. Below there were feathery palm trees and small white houses set about a square. It was a glamorous scene, above all by candlelight. But tonight Arrietty had stared without seeing. The wood of the cigar box is thin, and Arrietty, lying straight and still under the quilt, had heard the rise and fall of worried voices. She'd heard her own name. She'd heard Homily exclaim, "Nuts and berries, that's what they eat!" And she'd heard after a while the heartfelt cry of, "Oh, what shall we do?" So when Homily appeared beside her bed, she wrapped herself obediently in her quilt, and padding in her bare feet along the dusty passage, she joined her parents in the warmth of the kitchen. Crouching on her little stool, she sat, clasping her knees, shivering a little, and looking from one face to another. Homily came beside her, and, kneeling on the floor, she placed an arm around Arrietty's skinny shoulders. "Arrietty," she said gravely, "you know about upstairs?" "What about it?" asked Arrietty. "You know about the 2 giants?" "Yes," said Arrietty, "Great-aunt Sophie and Mrs. Driver." "That's right," said Homily, "and Crampfurl in the garden." She laid a roughened hand on Arrietty's clasped ones. "Just to tell you, Great-aunt Sophie is the old lady who lives she's an invalid, so she stays in bed all the time. Mrs. Driver is the housekeeper, and Crampfurl, it's a funny name, he's the gardener, so he does all the gardening outdoors." Homily said to Arrietty, "You know about Uncle Hendry?" Arrietty thought a while. "He went abroad," she said. "Emigrated," corrected Homily, "to the other side of the world, with Aunt Loopy and all the children. To a badger's set, a hole in a bank under a hawthorn hedge. Now, why do you think he did this?" "Oh," said Arrietty, her face alight. To be out of doors, to lie in the sun, to run in the grass, to swing on twigs like the birds do, to suck honey. Oh, nonsense, Arrietty, exclaimed Homily sharply. That's a nasty habit. And your Uncle Henry's a rheumatic sort of man. He emigrated, she went on, stressing the word, because he was seen. Oh, said Arrietty. The reason why Homily is so upset, as I've said, is when the little people get seen by people upstairs, it usually means that they have to move away. And that's why Uncle Henry, her uncle, had to move away with his family, because he was seen. He was seen, said Homily, by Rosa, the maid. She dusted him, they say, with a feather duster, and he stood so still alongside a little figure that she might never have noticed him if he hadn't sneezed. She was new, you see, and didn't know all the ornaments. We heard her screeching right here under the kitchen, and he could never get her to clean anything much after that. That wasn't chairs or tables, least of all the tiger skin rug. I don't hardly never bother with the drawing room, said Pod. Everything's got its place like, and they see what goes. There might be a little something left on a table or down the side of a chair, but not without there's been some company, and there never is no company, not for the last 10 or 12 year. Sitting here in this chair, I can tell you by heart every blessed thing that's in that drawing room, working round from the cabinet by the window to the... There's a mint of things in that cabinet, interrupted Homily. Solid silver, some of them. A solid silver violin they got there, strings and all. Just right for our Arrietty. What's the good, asked Pod, of things behind glass? Couldn't you break it, suggested Arrietty. Just a corner, just a little tap, Her voice faltered as she saw the shocked amazement on her father's face. Listen here, Arrietty, began Homily angrily, and then she controlled herself and patted Arrietty's clasped hands. She don't know much about borrowing, she explained to Pod. You can't blame her. She turned again to Arrietty. Borrowing's a skilled job, an art like. Of all the families who've been in this house, there's only us left. And do you know why? Because your father, Arrietty, is the best borrower that's been known in these parts since, well, before your granddad's time. Even your Aunt Loopy admitted that much. When he was younger, I've seen your father walk the length of a laid dinner table after the gong was rung, taking a nut or sweet from every dish and down by a fold in the tablecloth as the first people came in at the door. You'd do it just for fun, wouldn't you, Pod? Pod smiled warmly. There wasn't no sense in it, he said. Maybe, said Homily, but you did it. Who else would dare? I were younger then, said Pod. He sighed and turned to Arrietty. You don't break things, lass. That's not the way to do it. That's not borrowing. Oh, we were rich then, said Homily. Oh, we did have such lovely things. You were only a tot, Arrietty, and you wouldn't remember. We had a whole suite of walnut furniture out of the doll's house, and a set of wine glasses in green glass, and a musical snuff box, and the cousins would come and we'd have parties. Do you remember, Pod? Not only the cousins, the harpsichords came. Everybody came except those overmantels with the morning room. From the morning room, and we dance, and the young people would sit out by the grating. 3 tunes that snuff box played: Clementine, God Save the Queen, and the post-chaise gallop. We were the envy of everybody, even the overmantels. Who were the overmantels? Asked Arrietty. Oh, you must have heard me talk of the Overmantels, exclaimed Homily, that stuck-up lot who lived in the wall high up among the lath and plaster behind the mantelpiece in the morning-room. And a queer lot they were. The men smoked all the time because the tobacco jars were kept there, and they climbed about in and out of the carvings of the overmantel, sliding down pillars and showing off. The overmantel is like a decorative bit above the fireplace in the drawing room. The women were a conceited lot too, always admiring themselves in all those bits of overmantel looking glass. They never asked anyone up there, and I, for one, never wanted to go. I've no head for heights, and your father never liked the men. He's always lived steady, your father has, and not only the tobacco jars but the whisky decanters too were kept in the morning room, and they say those overmantel men would suck up the dregs in the glasses through these quill pipe cleaners they keep there on the mantelpiece. I don't know whether it's true, but they do say that those overmantel men used to have a party every Tuesday after the bailiff had been to talk business in the morning room. Laid out they'd be, dead drunk, or so the story goes, on the green plush tablecloth all among the tin boxes and the account books. Now, Homily, protested Pod, who did not like gossip. I never seed 'em. But you wouldn't put it past them, Pod. You said yourself when I married you not to call on the Overmantels. Well, they lived so high, said Pod, that's all. Well, they were a lazy lot, that much you can't deny. They never had no kind of home life. Kept themselves warm in winter by the heat of the morning fire, and ate nothing but breakfast food. Breakfast, of course, was the only meal served in the morning room. What happened to them? Asked Arrietty. Well, when the master died and she took to her bed, there was no more use for the morning room, so the Overmantels had to go. What else could they do? No food, no fire. It's a bitter cold room in the winter. And the harpsichords? Asked Arrietty. Homily looked thoughtful. Well, they were different. I'm not saying they weren't stuck up to, because they were. Just to tell you that a harpsichord is a kind of piano, so it lived inside the workings of the little harpsichord. Your Aunt Loopy, said Homily, who married your Uncle Hendreary, was a harpsichord by marriage, and we all know the airs she gave herself. Now, Homily, began Pod. Well, she'd no right to. She was only a rain pipe from the stables before she married harpsichord. And Loopy was called that before she got married because she lived underneath the rain pipe in the stables. The borrowers always get their names from where they live. So harpsichords lived in the harpsichord, the Overmantels lived in the overmantel, and the rain pipes lived underneath the rain pipe, and of course the clocks, Pod, Homily and Arrietty, they lived underneath the grandfather clock. So that's how they get their names. Why is it a come down being a clock? Asked Arrietty. Because we clocks live under the kitchen, that's why. Because we don't talk fancy grammar and eat anchovy toast. But to live under the kitchen doesn't say we aren't educated. The clocks are just as old a family as the harpsichord, so you remember that, Arrietty, and don't let anyone tell you different. Your grandfather could count and write down the numbers up to, what was it, Pod? 57, said Pod. There, said Homily, 57. And your father can count, as you know, Arrietty. He can count and write down the numbers on and on, as far as it goes. How far does it go, Pod? Close on 1,000, said Pod. There, exclaimed Homily, and he knows the alphabet because he taught you, Arrietty, didn't he? And he would have been able to read, wouldn't you, Pod, if you hadn't had to start borrowing so young? Your Uncle Hendreary and your father had to go out borrowing at 13. Your age, Arrietty. Think of it. But I should like, said Arrietty. So, he didn't have your advantages, went on Homily breathlessly, and just because the harpsichords lived in the drawing room, They had to move to the linen press, or some such name. What did they live on? Asked Arrietty in the drawing-room. Afternoon tea, said Homily. Nothing but afternoon tea. No wonder the children grew up peaky. Of course, in the old days it was better. Muffins and crumpets and such, and good rich cake and jams and jellies. And there was one old harpsichord who could remember a syllabub of an evening. But they had to do their borrowing in such a rush, poor things. On wet days, when the human beings sat all afternoon in a drawing-room, the tea would be brought in and then taken away again without a chance of the harpsichords getting near it. And on fine days it might be taken out into the garden. Lupe's told me that sometimes there were days and days when they lived on crumbs and on water out of the flower vases. So you can't be too hard on them. They're only comfort, poor things, to show off a bit and talk like ladies and gentlemen. Did you ever hear your Auntie Lupe talk? Yes. No, I can't remember. Oh, you should have heard her say parquet. That's the stuff the drawing-room floor's made of. Parquet, she used to say. Oh, it was lovely. Come to think of it, your Aunt Lupe was the most stuck up of them all. Arrietty's shivering, said Pod. We didn't get the little maid up to talk about Aunt Lupe. Nor we did, cried Homily, suddenly contrite. You should have stopped me, Pod. There, my lamb, tuck this quilt right round you, and I'll get you a nice drop of piping hot soup. And yet, said Pod, as Homily, fussing at the stove, ladled soup into the teacup, we did, in a way. Did what? Asked Homily. Get her up to talk about Aunt Lupe. Aunt Lupe, Uncle Hendreary, and Eglatina. Let her drink up her soup first, said Homily. There's no call for her to stop drinking, said Pod. And that's the end of that chapter. Hope you enjoyed it. It's a lot of history about all of the families and where they came from and how they're not in the house anymore. And Arrietty and Pod and Homily don't know whether they're still around. We'll have to see, won't we? So, now for today's quiz. So, first question. Do you remember me talking about where the families live and they get their names? So, question 1. Where does Arrietty, Pod and Homily live? Okay. Question number 2. Who saw Uncle Hendreary? Okay. And number 3. What food did the Overmantels eat? Okay. Good luck with the quiz, and I'll give you the answers next time. Okay. Cheerio for now.